Hello, listeners. Welcome to Inside TechCom with your host, Zahra Mutabana. In Season 3, we shift our focus to shed light on why technical communication is a core business asset. In this regard, we will speak with guests who are our stakeholders, such as product managers, marketing professionals, UX designers, QA, and customer support, who engage with writers to create a seamless experience for the customer and meet business goals together. Let's get started. Our guest today is Caity Cronkhite. Caity is the founder and CEO of Good Words LLC. Good Words is the premier technical writing and communications consulting firm. Her company delivers ongoing strategic, management, and implementation support for clients' technical writing needs. Caity's company has worked with technically sophisticated Fortune 500 companies to 5-person startups. Hi, Caity. So glad to have you here. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Zora. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing great.
Awesome. And I'm equally excited to be talking to you. Really humbled to have you on my show.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Likewise.
So, Caity, please tell us about yourself.
Totally. Well, as you said, I am currently the founder and CEO of Good Words LLC. And as you said, we are a technical writing and communications consulting firm serving all kinds of clients, mostly in high-tech industries. So everything from software, new programming languages, cryptocurrency and blockchain, finance and fintech, and aerospace, and everything in between. So I actually started my career as a technical writer myself. I got a degree in technical writing and communications from Carnegie Mellon University. And so I started my career as a technical writer working for various enterprise technology companies in the San Francisco Bay Area. And my career took several interesting turns, and I eventually started my own freelance business after a few years in the industry. And my freelance business actually turned into Good Words, my current company. So now we have a staff of about 20 technical writers who work on projects for our clients, and just really excited to work with so many great writers every day who are working on some of the world's most interesting technology.
That's fantastic. I don't believe I have run into writers who've become consultants. So this is a great opportunity for me to pick your brains and to understand what that journey was like, transitioning from an individual contributor to an entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
So how long ago did you start the company?
So I started freelancing in 2015, and I actually incorporated the company in 2017, but the company definitely grew out of my own freelance work.
That's fantastic. That's amazing. So how was that journey like?
It was really fun and really interesting. So the way it started was in 2015, I was actually working as a full-time solo technical writer at a drone startup in San Francisco. And unfortunately, that startup started to go the way of the startup. They were running out of money and had gone through a couple of rounds of layoffs, which is unfortunate. But it became pretty clear to me at that time that I needed to start looking for something else. And before I had taken that role, I had worked in several large enterprise technical writing teams. And so I started looking for new career options. Initially, I was just looking to take on another technical writing role at another company. But as I was looking around, I was mostly finding roles that were very similar to what I had already done. And I wasn't finding a lot of opportunities that really inspired me or that I felt were going to help me grow in my career. So I had considered for a while trying freelance projects or consulting or contract work. And at that point, I basically just didn't have any better ideas. And I thought, why not? Why not try it now? So I took my first freelance project, which was a small part-time freelance technical writing project for Airbus. And I was actually working on new designs for commercial airliners, which was really interesting. And I was just trying it out. I just wanted to see, if it might be a good fit for me. And I wasn't sure. But after that first project, I was totally hooked. And I'm lucky in that technical writing actually translated really well into a sustainable freelance career. So I got to work on lots of interesting projects and for lots of interesting clients as a freelancer. So I worked on everything from like I said, commercial airliners to new experimental blockchain projects. And at a certain point, I had too much work and I had too many clients and I had too many interesting things to work on. And so I sort of hit this fork in the road at that point where I could either turn down some of those projects that I didn't have time to take on, or I had the opportunity to bring on another writer or two to my team to kind of help take on some of those projects that I didn't have time for. And I just kind of went for it and decided to hire a couple of writers that I had worked with previously in my career. And that was sort of the birth of GoodWords. And since then, we've grown, like I said, to about 20 writers working for clients in a variety of technical industries, all across the US. So that's been really exciting.
That's awesome. That's impressive, actually. So it's not been really that long since you started.
It really hasn't, but there is definitely a marketplace for this kind of work. I mean, technical writing is a niche market, and it's hard for companies and clients to find people who are well-versed in this industry and who know the industry standards and best practices. So it's been a really fortunate niche for me to be in my career.
That's awesome. So when you said a couple of things that I think I would like to ask. One is, are these writers full-time with you now?
So we have a flexible work model. So most of our writers are full-time. They do opt to work 40 hours a week, but we also have plenty of writers on our staff who are half-time or part-time or who work on multiple projects at once. So we like to be really flexible with our consultants. One of the reasons why I started the company and one of our values actually is flexible work. And one of the reasons why I started the company was because I wanted to make freelancing, the joy of freelancing that I got from my own freelance days, more accessible to more people. Jumping into a freelance career can be kind of scary for a lot of people. Right. Everyone has the same questions of, well, how do I get insurance? How do I know how much to charge? How do I pay for my vacations? And so what we try to do is we call GoodWords a soft place for freelancers to land. We like to make the joys of freelancing more accessible to more people and also give them more support than they would normally get in a normal freelancing environment.
I love that, because I have sort of wondered what would it be like if I had to freelance, if I had to pivot and go independent on contract or something. And it's always been an intimidating thought for me to know that you have done it, and with such success. It speaks volumes, I suppose. So congratulations on that success, of course.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome. You mentioned that technical writing is a niche field, which is true. It is a very niche field. So now, did you have clients? It appears when you started this business, this consulting business, you had more work than you could handle by yourself.
Yes.
Which is a great thing.
Yes, definitely a good problem to have.
It's a good problem to have. Now, as your business has grown over time and you've grown your team, do you still have that same interest where, you're getting that business, like even with all the ups and downs that we've seen in the economy in the past few years?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's been a really interesting time to be supporting our clients. So I would say that we have also seen those ups and downs, certainly. I would say that we are kind of in a unique position because we're consultants and because we work on a contract basis, that we actually tend to get more work and we tend to get busier when clients are, or when there's a more difficult kind of economic time going on in the marketplace. So for example, right now, several of our clients are really nervous about having to implement hiring freezes or perhaps cut down on full-time employees. But because of that, they tend to turn to their vendors and to consultants to take on more work on a more temporary basis. So for better or worse, it actually tends to help our business a little bit. It tends to bring a little more work our way, which is always kind of an interesting shift from the rest of the marketplace.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have expected to hear that. That's good that when the times are going to get tough, your business hopefully becomes more secure in the sense that companies kind of become more reliant on you.
Yeah. And we like to be able to be a trusted resource and partner for our clients who are going through this difficult time. I mean, it's very hard to have to make decisions to either lay people off or to cut back on full-time hiring. But one of the things I always try to encourage my clients to think about is documentation and technical writing can really help your company stay stable and scale during times of change. So, we appreciate our clients who stick with us, and we try to be as helpful a resource during difficult times as we possibly can.
It is sad when the layoffs happen, no doubt. But at the same time, I believe the flip side of that is those who are freelancers, it's a good opportunity for them to sort of take ownership of where your career is going and probably join you so that if they've been laid off, then they can have this source of income.
Yes, definitely. And I actually encourage writers who are interested possibly in trying contracting or freelancing that don't be afraid of the downturns, because those actually tend to help contract consulting and freelance workers, just in terms of there tends to be more work available, a wider variety of work, a bigger demand for people to work on a consulting and contract basis. So it actually could be a really good time to explore that as a career option for people who are interested in it.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned something very interesting, or at least I think it is very interesting, is that when there is this sort of a downturn that happens, you try to convince companies to sort of create stable documentation. Is that right?
Yeah, it's part of what I said. The message I try to give to all of our clients is that good documentation, well-maintained documentation, can help your company scale and can help your company be more stable during times of change, whether that's times of growth or, times of layoffs or anything in between.
I want to dig into that.
Yes.
What does that mean in your opinion? What does that mean? When you say it allows you to scale, how do you pitch that to a client? And I have seen where many companies are not convinced about documentation, or they don't see the value that documentation sort of brings to the bottom line. The very fact that you said that it allows you to scale, please tell me, what does that mean? How do you do it? I really want to know more about that.
Totally. And I would say that I have had the same experience that you have had in talking to dozens and dozens of clients over the years that I've had my business. The perception of documentation by most people tends to be that documentation is boring, is a burden on the business, is something that they have to do for compliance reasons or whatever, but no one wants to do it. So it's usually an afterthought in most companies and in most businesses. But I try to help them see the immense opportunity that lies in documentation. And it comes from a number of places. So the first is that documentation is a customer support tool, first and foremost. So your customers and your clients want to go to documentation first to solve their own problems. They usually want an easy to use self-service option to answer their questions. And, we've worked, for example, with several startup clients who have put documentation on the back burner and haven't invested in it. And then they come to us because they lose a critical deal or they lose a critical customer because they didn't have their product documented well. And their customer or their prospect went with another company whose product was maybe just as good, but better documented. That's something that I really advise my clients to consider is how can you use documentation to engender trust in your product and also help advance the sales process sometimes. Documentation can be an effective sales tool if you use it that way. Most people don't think about doing that, but I have seen it be quite effective in a couple of my clients' conversations with their prospects. In addition, most of these companies that aren't investing in technical writers to actually work on their documentation, some of our clients will come to us and maybe they even have some documentation already, but usually it's been written by engineers or by product people. It's usually out of date. It's usually been written by someone within the company who didn't really have time to do it in the first place and didn't have the training to do it and certainly doesn't want to maintain it going forward. And I always try to encourage our clients and our prospects to do a cost benefit analysis. Really think about how much money are you already spending to write documentation that isn't any good and isn't serving anyone. So for example, a really easy example is, if your engineers are spending 5 hours a week contributing to the documentation, one, that documentation probably isn't going to be very good because they're not writers and they don't do this for a living. They don't know the best practices and industry standards. But number two, an engineer is a highly trained, highly paid, and revenue generating employee. So every time you ask an engineer or a PM or someone in your executive or VP team to contribute to the documentation, you're actually incurring a huge hidden cost there. You are getting a product that's not as good as something you would get with a professional writer. And you are taking those people away from their critical revenue generating roles and functions within your company. So I think that those are some things that most people don't think about when they think about documentation and how it can work for them in their company. And the last thing I will say about how documentation can help you scale and help impact your bottom line is companies without documentation often rely on customer support people or professional services implementation teams to provide support for their products. Those roles and those functions are incredibly expensive. There was a report that I read some time ago. I don't know if I can find it, but it struck me because it said that every time a customer picks up the phone to talk to a customer support representative, depending on your product and the technical complexity of it, those calls cost anywhere between $50 and $500 a piece. So if your customers are picking up the phone and calling you with the same problems over and over and over, then you're just spending money to try to support those people with those issues when, it's entirely possible that maybe a couple of good, well-placed topics or documentation pieces can help them resolve those problems on their own for a much lower cost.
You have given me so much of information there.
That was a lot. I'm sorry.
No, that is great. If I had to pick apart all of that, I would probably have a lot of questions. But I was taking notes as you were talking about it. I think, like you said, the perception of documentation is everything that you said. It's boring. It's an afterthought. I think in many places that is true. It is looked at as an afterthought, which is so sad. And I would like to share this, as you were talking about scaling, I was with this company where they were working with a prospect and the client was not willing to sign until they had seen what the documentation looked like, which was empowering in a way. But the team, the leadership also invested that time in making sure that the documentation was of quality.
Yeah, that's amazing. Love to hear that.
Those stories are probably far and few. I have worked at several companies, and out of the many companies that I have worked at, this was probably one of those few companies where the customer wanted to see documentation, and it was a $3 million deal, $3 million that was banking on it. And we had to provide that documentation. And they were like, is it going to be as detailed as this? Because the product was it was a pilot. So the customer wanted to be convinced that it is going to be as detailed as what they're seeing for an existing product. So they were really invested. So the company was invested, the customer was invested. So I definitely sort of what you were saying, it resonated with me that I've been in that seat where I got to contribute to the ROI.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'd forgotten about it.
And I think that's an empowering anecdote for documentation writers, technical writers, and documentation teams in other companies as well, is if used skillfully and if your documentation is good and supports your customers well, it can help close $3 million deals. I've seen it happen. So as have you.
Right. I'm sure that you've seen this far more than I have. So has there been a time when, a customer had documentation that was just being maintained and you had to sort of review that and say, okay, these are the deliverables that you might want to update? Like, do you help the client evaluate what should be maintained, what should be updated, so that probably they're coming with a tight budget.
Yeah, we do a lot of projects like that, especially for our startup and smaller business customers. So many of our customers will come to us with some degree of documentation. And many of them come to us with documentation that maybe has been written by engineers, or maybe it all lives in Google Docs and they need a new system for that. So it's a huge part of what we do is to kind of evaluate not just what's in the documentation, but holistically look at documentation and how it's working for these companies. So, maybe you have documentation, but what are the bottlenecks? What are the challenges with it? Is it hard to update? Is the tool difficult to use? Are customers getting lost? Are they unable to find the information they need? Or do you need maybe a new tool or a new platform for writing and maintaining documentation? Do you maybe need new internal operations and systems to support keeping documentation up to date? So that's a huge part of what we do, especially for some of our smaller clients who maybe don't have mature documentation environments yet. And I would say maintenance is a huge reason that people come to GoodWords and come to us and talk to us about documentation. Is documentation isn't too hard to write the first time, but what our clients run into is that maintaining it is a much bigger job than they ever anticipated, and that they need someone who's sort of dedicated to that task from release to release or from month to month to be able to make that sustainable for their organization. So that's a lot of what we do as well.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. Caity, you mentioned good documentation. In my experience so far, I have struggled with how do I prove documentation is good? Please share with us your insights and what, in your opinion, stands as good documentation.
I think good documentation is documentation that solves a real problem. So one of the ways that if you have access to these metrics, or if your listeners have access to certain metrics that I like to measure whether documentation is effective or not, is look at customer support cases. Look at the questions that your customers are asking when they pick up the phone. And is the volume of those calls going down, or is that being improved? Is the time that customer support reps spend getting to resolution on those questions, is that going down, lowering? That is a very concrete way, if you have access to that data, to be able to tie it to, not just effectiveness, but also cost savings as well. But in terms of good documentation, one thing that many of our clients do before they start working with us is they think more documentation is better. They assume that if you document everything in the kitchen sink, that your documentation is thorough. That means it's good and it's effective for your customers. And then if you actually look at customer behavior in using the documentation, customers will go to that documentation and it's overwhelming to them. They can't find what they need because every single label, every single button, every single edge case is documented in some kind of Frankenstein documentation system. So what I always encourage clients to really focus on is have a streamlined documentation strategy and philosophy. And usually what I recommend is document the top 80% of what your customers are trying to do. So in that 80% is where most of your customers are spending all of their time. They're trying to do these few core tasks. They're trying to accomplish these few core goals. And anything that's kind of outside of that 80% is probably, those are probably edge cases or information that, most of your customers don't need to know. And I find that kind of sticking to that 80% rule usually makes documentation systems much more streamlined and much easier to navigate for your actual customer.
I think that makes complete sense to me. Again, I'm kind of going back into my past. I was at a company where they wanted tech writers to document everything, absolutely everything. And we were a small team, and it was not easy for us to keep up with like you said, maintenance is a big task.
Yes.
And information has to flow for us to document. We did not have access to SMEs. And every time documentation was reviewed, it was very toxic. The feedback was very negative.
Oh.
And this was one of those companies that I believe hopefully is a rarity.
I hope so.
Yeah, but it was, and they would always ask us, your documentation is not good. And I was advocating for this exact scenario that you suggested. So you sort of validated for me, looking at what is that 80% that the customers are doing. Now, if you are having a startup that is coming to you and they don't know what the user behaviors are, what is that 80%? How would you determine what that 80% would be?
Sometimes we as writers do that ourselves. I think the hallmark of a really great tech writer is a writer who can act as a user advocate and who can go into a new product environment and look at the product or look at the service the way a new customer would and ask all of the questions that a new customer would ask. So, that's one of the things that we love to do on my team at GoodWords. All of our writers are really into getting in there, testing the product and making sure they understand how customers are actually using it. That is, I would say, the first way, definitely. And then if possible, I think it's always an interesting exercise for writers or any member of the team really to try to listen in on some customer calls, see what questions your customers are asking of your support people or of your PMs or your product owners and people like that on your team, to just kind of get a sense of what are customers really up against? Like, what are they asking questions about? What do they care about? How are they talking about your products or your services or the goals that they're trying to achieve? I have found that to be incredibly enlightening over the course of my career and various clients that I've worked with. So that can also be a good way.
That's great advice, especially for somebody who is at a company and they don't have that data, or if they want to start tracking that data. I think your suggestions really make a lot of sense to see what you can obtain. Like, as you're doing your research, your analysis, you have this baseline and then you can sort of start measuring from that point onwards. Even internally, if you're creating an internal document, for example, what are some of the pain points that you're trying to solve? Yeah, that is fantastic. I think you've already sort of given us advice on what tech writers can do if they are either sole writers or if they are small teams and they're struggling with how do they prove their contribution to the bottom line. Is there anything else you would like to add, Caity?
The way I like to approach projects with our clients is that it doesn't have to be super complicated or super hard to get a good documentation system in place. As we talked about with the last question, it doesn't cost a lot of money to sit in on a couple customer calls and just kind of listen in to see what customers are saying and the questions that they're asking. You don't have to have the most robust and complicated documentation tools to start out necessarily. We work with a lot of small clients and small startups, for example, who are looking at investing in these huge learning management systems and documentation management systems. And sometimes that's the right answer. Sometimes that's what they need, but often it's not. Often to really serve their customers, all they need is a couple of good documents that can be easily distributed that live in Google Docs, so it's very different for every single environment and every single customer, depending on just the level of support that they need and what's going to be maintainable and sustainable for them.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think that definitely would be very helpful, especially I would apply that to my own self if I were a lone writer, especially. I would like to ask you, what kind of deliverables are customers looking for? Are PDFs still in demand?
That is a great question. Are you asking more about types of output?
Types of output. Yes. And again, This comes from my own past experience where we were advising our company, the leadership, to look at different ways of output because our customers were looking for information online. But somehow there was this constraint within the company where they believed that customers are not open to online content or embedded help. So PDFs was a big thing and it became a burden to maintain that. So I think it's the outputs that I'm asking about.
Yeah, I think it completely depends on your type of business and where your customers work. So, for example, most of the clients that we serve are software companies. They create enterprise level or consumer level software products and applications. The users of those applications are online because those products are online. So, for example, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to mail a customer a PDF or to ask them to print a PDF to use if they're working and doing their entire job on the internet. So, in those environments, it completely makes sense to invest probably only in online content or online content that can be converted easily to PDF, without someone actually having to manually do that process. That being said, there are some environments where PDFs are still very useful and necessary. In the work that we've done with some clients, those environments tend to be large manufacturing environments or, in field work, for example. So if the user of your product is on a factory floor that doesn't have access to Wi-Fi, they're not going to be able to find that information online, right? Or if the customer is working out in the field repairing cell phone towers and they might not necessarily have access to robust internet connection, a PDF might absolutely be the most appropriate way to go. We also get a lot of questions about video content. People are in love with video content. And I have lots of thoughts on that. A lot of our clients are like, oh, can you just make our whole documentation library just a video content library instead? And I always try to walk people back from that for a few reasons. The first is one that you mentioned is video is very hard to maintain and it's very expensive to maintain and requires not just video production people and things like that to maintain those assets, but also requires someone who's familiar with your software products to be able to make sure that that content is accurate. And also, videos are very hard to translate. So if you have any sort of international reach or audience, or if you want to have international reach or audience, then you will either have to recreate those videos in all of those languages, or at the very least, translate them into other languages. I do think that there are reasons to invest in video, perhaps for very specific issues that your customers are running into, but I always caution against investing solely in video for documentation content. But I think the thing that companies should ask themselves is, where are their customers and where will they go looking for this content? It's probably online, but not always.
That was going to be my follow-up question to you. What do you think about video? And you just read my mind and shared your input. So fantastic. I don't have to worry about it.
No worries. I mean, people love video, and video is an awesome, learning tool and sort of supplemental material if you can afford to implement it well. But like I said, it's usually not what I recommend for most of your documentation or kind of your base documentation implementation.
That makes absolute sense, and like you said, where are your customers going to look for information? And how is that information, how easy is it to find, and how quickly can it solve their problem? And if you have connectivity issues, then it doesn't make sense. So sometimes probably these considerations are not being made. And this is where your expertise as a writer comes into play, because you sort of put yourself in the shoes of the customer and you can speak for the customer as a customer advocate, as a 100%. User advocate.
Yes, absolutely.
That's awesome. I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you, because there are many of these things that either we've encountered or we've thought about and not really articulated. And you are experiencing this in the field, and this is how you're communicating our value to the customers, to your clients.
Yes.
So that's fantastic. An interesting question that, or rather, I was on LinkedIn and I was on this one group discussion, and the question there was technical writing and AI, artificial intelligence, and how artificial intelligence at some point may replace technical writers. I'm sure you have an opinion on that. If you do, would you like to share what that is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly have have a vested interest in where that field might go. I have yet to see any sort of AI implementation that does work good enough to replace a good writer. So, yeah, I mean, it'll be a very interesting time if it ever gets to that point. But I think something that's interesting about that is that I think people really underestimate the human element of technical writing and documentation. And the reason why we need documentation, the reason why customers ask for it, is because they are people with problems that need to be solved and goals that they need to achieve. And the value of having a human writer who is an expert in this field is that we can, as you said earlier, act as those user advocates and really put ourselves in a human user's shoes to be able to understand what their problems are and the goals that they're trying to accomplish and the pain points that they might encounter along the way. I think people really underestimate how important it is to have the right person in the right seat writing documentation or working on your technical writing and communications, because that's how people understand your product and your brand and the service that you're trying to provide. So I think people want to be able to outsource it to an AI algorithm and never think about it again. Realistically, I don't think that the technology is in any place to actually solve a real user's problem right now. So,
I mean, again, I was thinking along the same lines, and I do believe that the technology hasn't matured to that point. And even if it matures, like you said, you are trying to solve real human problems. And the more complex the technology gets, the more I believe that you need experienced writers who are trained, who can really solve those problems and who come with that mindset of, AI probably is going to have a very one-track approach, while the human mind can look beyond what is obvious and try to solve those problems. I may not be articulating this well, but I think you're right, that technology is not there yet. And hopefully we will continue to work with that technology and not get obsoleted, I hope.
I also hope so.
I think one thing that you mentioned about the branding, and I believe documentation is part of the brand. I've interviewed a product owner who was mentioning that he bought some product and it had great reviews. But the documentation, it was a scrap of paper. The feedback on, I don't know where he bought it from, but probably Amazon, the customer feedback was good. But then when he bought it and he was like, okay, the feedback was great, but I'm going to try and use this for my convenience. And he found that the documentation was not good enough and he ended up returning the product, or rather his user experience was not great and he wasn't impressed with it. So he believes that when he is working on a product, he pays equal attention to the documentation because the documentation is the brand and it's part of the product. It's not separate from the product. It's a deliverable that is part of the product. So I think that's what you're also trying to probably share with us, right?
I completely agree with that. And what that makes me think of is your documentation does a lot of frontline work for you. I mean, let's imagine that person, buying this product, users go to the documentation when they have a problem, when they are already frustrated or when they are already confused. And if they go to the documentation and they get more confused or more frustrated, that only makes for a worse user experience overall of not just the documentation, but of your entire product. Exactly. And if your customer can't figure out how to solve their problem, or if they can't figure out how to do the thing they came to do, then they'll return the product, or they'll pick up the phone and have an angry phone call with your support rep or something like that. So I think documentation is an unsung hero in that if done well, it can really shield you from those negative customer interactions, and it can really save your customer's interaction with your product.
That was so beautifully said.
Thank you.
We are the unsung heroes, but like you said, you have to look at it in the context of the user experience, how it can shield your brand if you've invested upfront in good documentation.
Yes. Absolutely.
That's an invaluable insight, in my opinion. So that's fantastic. Caity, we've, I think, sort of touched upon some good questions here, and I hope you found value in sort of sharing your insights with us. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I think we have touched on a ton in this interview. I mean, I this is a topic that I'm really interested in, really passionate about. I mean, obviously, my whole company is dedicated to technical writing and documentation. And, as we said earlier in the interview, most people don't consider technical writing or documentation to be a very sexy topic. But my point of view is that they just haven't thought about it in a broad enough context. Then documentation can solve a huge number of problems for you. And it can also open up a number of opportunities for, you to go further in your customer's journey, for you to, engender trust in your products, for you to, as we mentioned, increase sales opportunities in some deals and things like that. So I love talking about this stuff, and I'm so glad that you have me on.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's one more question that you prompted me right now. You said technical writing is not looked upon as sexy. Mm-hmm. And if I had to brand technical writing as sexy, somehow I keep thinking that, are we as writers not branding our field in a sexy way? Now, you've been at the front lines, talking to customers and actually trying to solve their problem. In your opinion, is there anything that we can do as advocates of our own profession? How do we make it sexy? That is the whole objective of this season, actually, honestly, of mine, is to package it in a sexy manner, but also to sort of elevate our profession in a sense. What would you suggest to make it sexy?
I think in the first place, being excited about what documentation can bring to an organization and the ways that it can help an organization. I've worked in several different technical writing teams over the years and with several different individual technical writers. And one thing I have seen many times is tech writers apologize for being in the spaces they need to be in. They apologize for taking up engineers' time, or they apologize for sitting in Scrum meetings, or on and on. And technical writers should be in those rooms, and they should be part of those discussions, and they can bring a huge amount of insight into those discussions, again, because they are the user advocate in the room. And I think just really stepping into that role and playing that up with stakeholders is really important. I think that people don't think of technical writing as sexy because people who aren't technical writers think that writing documentation just means there's someone sitting in a corner at a computer who doesn't interact with anyone, who writes PDFs all day, and that's all it is. Whereas, really great technical writers, as we've kind of touched on in this conversation, do so much in the process of doing their work and for an organization. They are testing products, they are interacting with engineers, they are usually subject matter experts in the technology. I've worked on teams where I knew more about the product than the PM did, or than some of the engineers did, just because I had such deep and wide views into how the product was developed. We look at the product through the eyes of the customer, and we're also working across such a wide range of subject matter experts when we work effectively on our teams. We're working with everyone from product managers to engineers to quality assurance people to designers, so we have a huge broad view of the impacts of the technology that we work on. And I think just ramp that up, just sell that internally in any organization that you work in, and bring awareness to the fact that we do much more than just sit in a corner and type all day.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes I do believe that everything you said, for one, not being apologetic, that's something that I have personally also applied to my own self, that I don't want to be apologetic about the time that because we're all working towards a product deliverable and trying to solve a problem, a customer problem. And we are all working as a team. So we definitely have to change that perception of us and not be apologetic, and getting your seat at the table. So very important. And then talking about how you're trying to solve a problem rather than, oh, I'm going to create content, but that content is trying to solve a real world problem.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So everything that you said, I am 100% in agreement with you, with what you said. And I'm so thrilled that there are other writers such as you who sort of are trying to advocate for the user and for our profession and trying to move the needle to making us look more sexy. I love that. I love that.
100%. And I loved, I'm an entrepreneur now and I now run my company full time, but I loved my years working on the ground, being a technical writer, looking at products, testing them, learning about new technologies. It was such an awesome time in my career where I got to learn so much about so many new and emerging technologies and work with a lot of interesting people. So I think that, as you said, we tech writers are the unsung heroes, and it's a fascinating profession to me, at least.
It is.
I'm biased, but
I'm absolutely biased. I'm passionate about this field. I'm so thrilled I had this opportunity to catch up with you, Caity. And this was really a fantastic conversation at so many levels. I really appreciate your contribution to the field and to my show.
Oh, thank you, Zora. I really appreciate your having me on your show. Likewise, this was a super fun conversation, and I hope your listeners get some value out of it.
I am absolutely sure that they will. Have a great long weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app, such as Apple, Google, or Spotify. For the latest on my show, follow me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or visit us at www.insidetechcom.show. Catch you on another episode.